Hello, friends. Welcome to Experience Data Talk, a show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. My name is Mike Delgado, and this is episode number 121. Today, we're chatting with Dr. Marcello Ienca. Dr. Ienca is a senior research fellow at the Health, Ethics, and Policy Lab for the Department of Health Sciences and Technology at ETH Zürich. His latest article that he co-authored with Effie Villena was just published in Nature, and it's about the responsible use of digital data to tackle COVID-19. And in the article, they argue that leveraging big data and AI is a moral imperative during this COVID-19 pandemic, and that this data must be used in a responsible, scientific way to also protect privacy. Dr. Ienca earned his PhD in biomedical ethics at the University of Basel and studied philosophy and neuroscience at NYU. In today's show, Marcello talks with us about how technology is used for data collection to help combat COVID-19, and also the data ethical challenges on protecting public health while also protecting privacy rights. He also shares how Taiwan used big data and AI to effectively contain COVID-19, and he also gets into the problem of the technology gap and digital inequity that's causing a huge problem right now. Dr. Ienca also shares a ton of other fascinating insights on how digital data is collected and used in various countries. I had a blast chatting with Dr. Ienca, and I learned a ton from him. Here's our conversation. Marcello, welcome to Data Talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I saw your article in Nature on the responsible use of digital data to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Awesome article. And I wanted to start by asking you what led you to write this?
Well, first of all, I should say that this is collaborative work. This is a paper that I co-authored with Effie Villena, who is a professor of bioethics at ETH in Zürich. And I would say probably the background, the main consideration that led us to write this article is of historical nature. This is not the first time that humanity is facing a global epidemic, a pandemic. We have experienced it, and we went through several pandemics over the last history, the last century. One relatively recent one is, as you might recall, the SARS epidemic in 2002, 2003. That was 17 years ago. But we wanted to, we were asking ourselves, what has changed since this pandemic and all previous epidemics that humanity has faced? And many things have not changed. Our ability to prevent and reduce the contagion chain of respiratory disease has not improved that much. Our antiviral drugs have not improved significantly either, but we have a brand new tool, and that is digital data and algorithms. We live today in 2020 in a significantly more interconnected and digitalized world compared even to the world of 2003. That was in the paper we mentioned that the amount of data produced by mankind since its origins until 2003 is now produced only within a few minutes. So we think that we have a moral obligation towards leveraging the potential and mobilizing the potential of digital technology, of data and artificial intelligence for the social good, and try to use them for monitoring, containment, and other public health purposes in the fight against COVID-19. But at the same time, we have to be extremely mindful that precisely because these technologies have such great potential, we have to use them properly. And we need to define what are the criteria or requirements for responsible use of data and algorithms, because if we fail to do so, we might have quite counterproductive effects, including fueling public distrust. If there is, for example, secrecy in data agreements, people might lose trust in governments and public health authorities. If we introduce errors in our computational models, this can lead to outsized effects. And also, if we violate privacy rights, then we might lose not only our safety at some point, but also our civil liberties and our fundamental rights. So this is pretty much the background story of this article.
As you started to do your research, what were some of the data sources and also types of algorithms that immediately concerned you as you started to go through all of this?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that concern is my first emotional reaction to this. Hope is my first emotional reaction. I really think that there is a great potential for using these technologies for the good. But of course, there are concerns. There are several types of technologies that can be used. We're trying to map the various applications that countries worldwide are developing, and I think we can cluster them into maybe four main categories. So one is proximity and contact tracing. So proximity tracing is basically trying to measure whose paths have crossed. So which individuals came in contact by measuring relative spatial proximity between two devices. Contact tracing is when an individual tests positive for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, then we can use the history, the data history of that person in order to understand which people that person came in contact with. Then another domain of application is quarantine compliance. So it's using digital tools to understand who is actually properly complying with forced quarantine. Then we have symptom checkers that are usually based on self-reports. So you can use these tools to monitor on a day-by-day your symptoms and inform health authorities about that. And that can also be helpful to monitor the spread of the disease. And then the last one is mobility reports or flow modeling, which is basically what Google Analytics is doing. We use large-scale aggregated data in order to understand whether, for example, this quarantine measures or lockdown measures are effective. So if people are going less often to public parks or things like that. All these different applications have different degrees of intrusiveness and privacy sensitivity. Contact tracing, for example, is the one with the highest degree of privacy sensitiveness, because it's almost impossible to make it fully anonymous, because your starting point is an individual person who tested positive. But also quarantine compliance can be quite intrusive if it's done the way that it was done in China, for example, where cameras were placed outside the homes of people who were under forced quarantine. So these are all ways through which these technologies can be used in ways that can be infringing privacy. But at the same time, we can use this very same domains of technology in a different way. So, for example, if instead of using GPS signals, which can locate, that can identify the exact physical location with some degree of approximation of individual, if instead of you use proximity, for example, Bluetooth signal, then we can have a quite privacy compliant tool, because the Bluetooth signal doesn't tell you where you exactly are. It just measures the relative proximity between two devices within a limited radius. So our exercise in this article was really trying to understand what are the requirements that we need to develop, which can probably further be translated into guidelines in order to leverage these technologies for public health purposes in a manner that doesn't violate or infringe fundamental rights.
I love the different categories you broke it down in proximity, the quarantine compliance, the symptom checkers. I'm kind of curious about the different devices that we're using that can relay this data back to these different providers.
Yeah, that's a good question, because the classification that I've outlined before is basically domains of application. It's not technological types. Then you can develop different types of technologies using different sorts of hardware and software in order to achieve these four purposes. And there are different tools that are being developed or that are in development. Many of these tools are smartphone app based. And there is a clear reason for that. There is a quite, the use of smartphones is quite widespread worldwide. It's a type of technology that is part of our everyday life, so we can capitalize upon this ubiquity of the technology. Software tools, especially app-based tools for smartphones, are also quite easy to develop. This is a quite promising area, quite promising technology, and several national governments, most notably Singapore, has launched a national public health app. It's called WeTrace or Trace Together, I think. And they're attempting to use this technology for the purposes I've mentioned before. But you can also use other types of data or other types of technology. For example, you can leverage mobile phone tower data that are usually anonymized, or you can use things like wearable devices or smart homes if your purpose is, for example, quarantine compliance. So there is also a wide spectrum of technologies that can be used. Now, one thing that I think it's important to point out, and I don't see it stressed enough out there, is that most of these technologies, including smartphones, which are probably among the most widespread globally, are not widespread enough, or at least they are not evenly distributed, because still about more than half of the world population doesn't own a smartphone. Especially people in emerging economies, they do not have the same adoption rates and ownership rates of smartphones as we do in Europe or in the United States. And this is problematic because this is a pandemic. It's not a disease that is localized only in highly industrialized countries. Countries like Brazil or increasingly India are struggling with the spread of the contagion. It's very important that we don't leave anybody behind by focusing on digital tools only. Even within highly industrialized countries, we have uneven distribution of technology use based on demographics. So in my home country, Italy, but also in countries like Canada, or surprisingly a highly technological country like Japan, most people over the age of 50 do not own a smartphone. And then again, if we focus exclusively on digital tools for disease surveillance, then by definition, we inherently do not consider a significant portion of the world population who doesn't have access to these technologies. And this can lead to health disparities and inequality.
Wow, that's huge. I wasn't aware of those statistics. What are some things that scientists need to be aware of as they're beginning to pull in this data so that they're not biased, so that they're more aware of what you're just pointing out? What are some things that they should be thinking about to help to improve their analysis of what they're seeing?
Well, we're speaking here at multiple levels, right? So one level that we're talking about is privacy and privacy requirements. And there, we don't really have to reinvent the wheel. There are privacy standards. There are experts in computer science and law that are working actively on things like data protection or privacy conscious technology, or privacy preserving technology. And there, I think we are quite advanced. We have techniques such as anonymization, encryption. We have powerful computational tools like differential privacy, secure multi-party computation, and many others, that homomorphic encryption that can be used for these purposes. So this is very important. We also have legal requirements. As you might know, the European Union has a new general data protection regulation, which is probably setting the new global bar in terms of data protection law. And there we have requirements such as purpose-specific data collection. So you have to specify the purpose for which you collect data, and you cannot repurpose your data without informing the data generator. There is a thing called data minimization, which means that you have to make sure that you only use the data that are strictly necessary for achieving a certain aim, and you avoid redundant use that is just, increasing your privacy risks without producing any collateral benefit. So there are several requirements that can be used. And I think here it's very important that our community tries to use the tools that we already have as much as we can, because we are operating under time pressure. As we speak, in this probably 10 minutes of our conversation, several hundred, if not 1,000 people got infected worldwide. So we have to be careful, and we also have to be mindful of this time pressure, and we have to develop tools fast and effectively.
Are there any data projects right now that you're keeping an eye on that you're really excited about?
The Singaporean example is a positive one for what I can tell from this preliminary assessment that we have done. There is also the positive experience of Taiwan. If you look at the epidemiological data from Taiwan, it's quite how they were able to contain the spread of the disease. They had only a few hundred cases, very low mortality, and they made great use of various types of technological application, of big data and artificial intelligence. For example, they cross-check different sorts of data repositories that they had, including national registries, insurance, data from airports and border patrol. And by combining these different data sources, they were able to contain significantly the spread of the disease. So that's also a very good example. If I look at the more prospective way, there is a network of European researchers that is attempting to develop a pan-European app for proximity tracing. And also, I still don't, they publish a white paper in which they describe, the basics of this tool. And I think this is also a very promising approach, because it addresses a very important issue, which is we should go beyond data nationalism. We need to have cross-border transmission of data and data processing, because if every nation develops their own tools without communicating with other countries, then we are, again, in trouble. Because this is a global problem, it's a global challenge, it's not a national challenge. So having at least this federated approach at the continental level, Europe is a big continent with 700 million people. So there is quite promise if we can develop at least a cross-national, multinational tool. So I would hope that, large countries like the United States can follow a similar example.
Do you see that more countries wanting to work together to share this data with each other?
I don't know if they want to. I know that they have to. Otherwise, we are all in trouble. I mean, part of the reason why the pandemic is so out of control and is having so severe effects on global health is probably because we didn't share data fast enough and in sufficient amount when we could. I mean, early this year, when there could have been a better transmission of data from China to other countries, or between China and the rest of the world. And then again, I saw the same thing happening at the beginning of the European contagion, where when some countries like Italy were on the front line of non-imported European contagion, and then other countries were not prompt enough in requesting, cross-national data sharing between the national authorities. So I think insufficient data sharing and insufficiently fast communication is one of the problems that we've faced so far and led us here.
Do you have any advice for data scientists right now that are working on trying to figure out ways to help solve this pandemic? They're working on projects, they're working with a lot of sensitive data potentially, and do you have any advice for them?
Well, most data scientists are actually well aware of these problems, and they are quite ethics conscious, I would say. But at the same time, they might be indirectly compelled by national authorities to create tools that collect and process data more than they should. Because epidemic responses are notably, if we look at the history, one of those circumstances where governments usually take the opportunity to expand their power and to take swift action, usually in an unchecked manner, given the time pressure of the situation. And this powers that they acquire during this so-called state of exception, sometimes they have the nasty habits of persisting after the end of the emergency. And we are already experiencing something like this in countries like Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the prime minister, has almost obtained unlimited power in order to tackle the disease. Given this background, it's not unlikely that governments might put pressure, or even ethically conscious data scientists, to develop tools that are more intrusive than they should. But at the same time, as I said, most data scientists are extremely conscious, and they're also well aware of the ethical issues at stake. Many of them do work together with ethicists and lawyers. So the pan-European tool that I mentioned before is the product of a joint collaboration between epidemiologists, data scientists, cybersecurity experts, and also ethicists and lawyers. So there are very promising multidisciplinary approaches that are flourishing in various parts of the world.
I liked in the very beginning you talked about the various types of data sources that are available. And I'm curious about, are there any new data sources that you're kind of excited about that you think could be really meaningful in the future for other pandemics that come up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I heard many colleagues already arguing that probably AI and big data will not help us much with this current pandemic. So we really have to work hard to make sure that they can help us out with the next pandemic. I'm not so pessimist. I think that there is still great potential for using the tools we have at their best. For example, if we move away for a second from pandemic surveillance, I think there's still some hope that we can use machine learning algorithms to identify faster which compounds can be potentially utilizable for developing a vaccine. And there is some research going on that is using this. Also, I think that AI models were not so unreliable when it came to predicting the size of the outbreak. There were studies that showed quite early that the pandemic was going to be very big, and that a significant portion of the world population would get infected at some point. In terms of different data sources, I don't know, because yes, big data is not all about data volume, it's also about data variety. It's also about integrating new data sources, including unconventional ones. But many of these new data sources, for example, using sensor data from wearable tools or things like that, have important data quality weaknesses. They are often unreliable, especially if they're coming from personal digital devices. There is often a data quality and data integrity issue, which is quite problematic if we want to use this data for public health purposes, because even minor errors can lead to outsized effect if deployed on the large scale. The same goes with app-based tools that try to collect self-reports, because reports are fallible, and so yeah, I'm not too pessimistic. I think we have to have an evidence-based approach. We have to be curious and explore what technology has to offer, but we also have to have a strong focus on scientific evidence, clinical validity, public health validity. We don't have to, follow the hype and think that since data and algorithms are cool, therefore they're gonna magically save us. They are gonna save us only if there is evidence and scientific proof that they are valid, that they can actually be used for in a good way, in an effective manner.
Marcel, I have not read your other types of articles you've written. Kind of curious, this piece right here, is this going to be a series? Are you focused right now on pandemics in your research?
Well, I think we are all focusing on pandemics right now. I know many colleagues in various areas of science that are now temporarily putting on hold their main field of research in order to basically be helpful for the global community in either directly fighting the disease. And, I have a lot of fantastic colleagues who are doing biomedical research, and now they are volunteering in ERs and ICUs. And I'm extremely proud and respectful of them. In my case, since I'm working primarily in the area of data ethics and ethics of artificial intelligence, this was not, a big move away from my habitual garden. I'm now trying to, do some translational work between these two communities, and how the tools and the requirements and guidelines that we have developed in the field of data and AI ethics can be useful for the global health community. And I think there is a lot of need for bridging the gaps between different areas of science and different disciplines right now, because we are all in this together, and we can get out of this together only.
That's right. That's right. As you are just doing so much research in this area, are there any data visualizations or certain projects you're looking at around this pandemic that are interesting to you that you think are really, really helpful?
Visualization tools, you said?
Yeah, anything that you've seen that has been really insightful to you that you think that more people need to know about?
Many of the followers of your podcast are used to the platform that was developed by researchers at Johns Hopkins to live track the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the number of COVID-19 cases worldwide. And this is a tool that is now part of my daily life. I check in order to compare the number of cases worldwide, which country is having an exponential growth in the number of cases, why certain countries have certain proportions between deaths and cases, and so on. So this is, I think, a tool that was extremely helpful for the entire public health community, and also for governments, for national authorities in monitoring the spread of the disease. I've also seen the Wordometer tool. They also collect quite vast types and quantities of data. They, on top of the Johns Hopkins data repositories, they also add things like how many hospital beds are currently used in each country, how close are they to saturation point, how many intensive care units beds are available, and so on. So I found that very useful as well. In terms of big tech platforms, I found quite useful the mobility reports that Google is making available. They are basically repurposing their Google Maps infrastructure in order to help with flow modeling and providing large-scale mobility reports to help authorities understand whether their lockdown policies are effective. So I found that useful as well. What I would find useful, and I haven't seen that yet, even though I came across an article that attempted to do so, is trying to map all these government-backed apps that nations are developing worldwide. Precisely because I want to avoid that we all reinvent the wheel independently in different parts of the world. So having a common platform where whoever wants to develop a new digital tool can, make that information available and comparable with other approaches, I think that would be very helpful. And maybe on a closing note on this, I'm a big advocate for open science and open source. And I think here is really an historical opportunity to put this kind of approaches to good use because we need transparent data sharing. We need open source approaches that give everyone the opportunity to improve the tools that we are developing, since we are operating, as I said many times, under big time pressure.
I was looking at a data visualization just the other day, and it was looking at how COVID has spread across different countries. And what I thought was really interesting was, at least the visualization I saw, was that how countries like South Korea have limited the spread through social distancing. And I'm kind of curious, like from a data perspective, if you've analyzed, I'm curious about what your perspective is on that, as you've seen certain countries like South Korea like really have very low rates of spread and also death rates compared to others.
Yeah, I mentioned Taiwan before, but I could have mentioned South Korea as well. So South Korea is the prototype country of effective containment measures implemented early enough. The success of South Korea is really a combination of a multi-approach because they combined the large-scale use of big data analytics and other forms of digital technology with aggressive testing. This is another thing that South Korea pioneered and still, I think, is representing the best standard worldwide in large-scale testing. Because this is something I haven't mentioned before, but developing digital tools for contact and proximity tracing is very important. But if we don't have sufficient tests, for the people that we identify as possible at risk because they came in contact with somebody with the disease, then these digital tools are nearly useless. So we need these two approaches in combination. We need to have digital tools that help us identify very promptly who are the people that need self-isolation because they came in contact with a COVID positive person, but at the same time we have to give them the possibility to test in order to know whether they are actually infected or not. So yeah, South Korea is a prototype case, paradigmatic case for successful use of this wide spectrum of public health measures. And yes, their data-driven approach is quite interesting. I think it would probably still look too privacy invasive from US eyes or also European eyes, I would say, because they combined various sorts of data records, including credit cards records, and they also created public repositories of data about individual locations, even though they were anonymized. But we know that anonymized data can be re-identified by hackers or whoever skilled actors. So I think many people in the West would consider their approach too intrusive, but there's no doubt that it was extremely effective. They were able to contain to a very low number of cases, about 10,000. They have an extremely low death rate. So I think this is a very important case to keep in mind.
Yeah, this is one of those like really difficult, complex issues that's happening where you want to protect people. You want to obviously lower death rates. You want to stop the spread. And South Korea has done that extremely well. But as you pointed out, there are some privacy concerns. And so that's like the big difficulty with all this right now.
That's the big difficulty of ethics. This is what ethics is all about. It's about finding the right balance between potentially conflicting principles. No right and no duty is in isolation. We always have conflicts between different rights. So in this case, we are experiencing potential conflict between two sets of ethical principles. On the one hand, we have the two ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, is promote the good and do no harm. And we do have a moral obligation to do so. I think it's clear that not using data that can lead to avoid preventable infections is not morally neutral, but it's morally negative. It's something that can lead to detrimental consequences for people and can be affecting their right to life and their safety. So we have a moral obligation to maximize the well-being and health of people worldwide and to prevent avoidable harm. So this is the first set of ethical principles. But on the other hand, we also have another set of ethical principles which involves privacy and respect for autonomy. So in order, we want to make people exercise control over their lives and their decisions. We don't want a strip of their privacy and informational rights, which are an important societal achievement and a fundamental right. Rights should not be negotiated so easily as soon as we need to solve a problem. So people have the right to keep their information private as far as they want, and they should have the right to consent to the use of their data and refuse to have their data accessed by third parties against their will. So these two sets of principles are in obvious conflict. And now I'm trying to simplify because we have even other conflicts. For example, the equality and fairness issue that I mentioned before. People that might be left behind because they do not have digital technologies, and therefore, we exacerbate pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities. So we really need to find the right balance between all these different sets of ethical principles and requirements. But this is a hard task, but not an impossible task. We do this all the time. When we develop a new law in a democratic country, we are balancing different types of rights and liberties and duties and ethical requirements. So we have to navigate this complexity and produce the best possible outcome based on the partial information that we have available.
Well, Marcello, I want to thank you just for all your insight and research into this area and just working on the ethical sides and trying to figure out how do we balance this, how do we work through this situation, because it is so complex. You just outlined very simply just a couple different issues, but there are so many issues at play here. So I want to thank you for sharing your perspective, sharing your work with us. For those that want to continue to follow your research, what's the best way for them to do that?
There's my institutional website if they want to know more about what I'm working on. But I am a quite frequent Twitter user. So I guess in terms of social media, Twitter is the main platform for that.
Okay, excellent. And I want to encourage everyone to check out his recent article. It's called On the Responsible Use of Digital Data to Tackle the COVID-19 Pandemic. It's on nature.com. I have a short URL that will send you directly to it. It's just ex.pn/COVID-19 data. That'll redirect you over to that Nature article. Marcello, thank you so much for being on Data Talk.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you and talk with you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Data Talk. We share out new episodes every single week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes as well as YouTube videos by going to the Experian News blog. The URL is just experian.com/datatalk. And as always, we love hearing from our community, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows, please reach out. You can find us on Twitter at Experian Data Lab, or you can always reach out to me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.